right, thank you very much for organizing this workshop. This has been amazing so far, and I'm really thrilled to be part of this. And I should say that what I'm presenting here is this one part of the larger project. I'm giving examples today from Warsaw and Vilna. My project also looks at Łódź. And this question of reading emotions that I've taken up for this project is something that I was doing kind of without realizing I was doing it, and then very late in the project decided I should think about what it actually means to read emotions and to think about emotions in diaries in particular. So it's kind of an old and new project at the same time. So I came to this topic through my research on victim representations of perpetrators in diaries written in ghettos in Poland during the Holocaust. And this is a topic that's been very rarely approached in study of the Holocaust, kind of surprisingly. This question of the interpersonal relations, or in my case, reactions, because it's less about the back and forth relations and more about, you know, how victims were conceptualizing perpetrators, is something that a lot of historians have just not thought was the most important part of the story. And when I started researching, I thought to myself, well, in fact, these were all humans, and in fact, in their writings, it turns out they addressed each other as humans, right, in all kinds of varieties of ways. And they also ousted them from the realm of the human, which is a lot of what I take up in my work. So the question of reading emotions in diaries in general, obviously, is a much broader topic. People have written about questions of reading emotions, but again, what I'm doing here is really about reading emotions in attempting to think about these representations of perpetrators very specifically. So originally, I imagined my study would be about, I thought victim conceptions of perpetrators. We're talking about Germans here, and that this would be all about different types of German perpetrators and different ways that Jews and Germans interacted during the Holocaust. But of course, as soon as I started reading the documents, I realized that paying attention to emotion words very specifically led me to something else. So as we know here, diarists often revealed the most intensely negative emotions and reactions when they wrote about persecutors who were closer to home rather than Germans, local perpetrators, and fellow Jews, which indicates that they did not think of perpetrators the same way that I had been thinking about them when I started my work. The observation that Jews often responded more strongly to fellow Jewish persecutors during the Holocaust is not new. People like Mark Grossman, David Roskis, Isaiah Chunk, Barbara Engelking, Liocek, all these people have written about this. But this study is really hoping to put emotions at the very center for the first time, and uses reading emotions as a way to comprehend how diarists reacted to perpetrators or persecutors or oppressors or those who caused them suffering. And this question of terminology is very important, and something that I'm constantly kind of shifting throughout the work in order to better understand the social relations among people in the context of the ghettos. So unlike many other histories of the ghettos, instead of trying to recreate the events of ghetto life, this study seeks to recapture the emotions and the resulting perceptions of daily living in the Nazi ghettos. Reading these emotions in ghetto diaries leads us to better understanding of the actual experience of daily life in the ghettos, as opposed to just its outer trappings. This follows the work of Amos Goldberg, among others. So Goldberg has written a lot on ghetto diaries, but I take this quote from a 2010 article where he says, quote, "Whereas current historical research into Jewish life during the Holocaust focuses mostly on formal and informal organizations, diaries could shift attention to the history of emotions, conceptualizations, consciousness, identities, and trauma, and depict the experience of the individual and the meaning of social and cultural interactions under extreme circumstances and within a broad cultural context," end quote. So this emphasis on the conceptualizations and perceptions of ghetto inhabitants recreated through the close reading of the diaries represents this methodology that I'm using here. So to read the affect that appeared in the ghetto diaries, I employed methods drawn from the extant theories on the history of emotions. The field has generally attempted to examine changes in emotions over time that can signify broader changes in society, or to understand the emotional vocabulary of a certain epoch. William Reddy explained the importance of analyzing feelings in history as follows, quote, "With reference to this concept of learned emotions, historical change again becomes meaningful. History becomes a record of human efforts to conceptualize our emotional makeup and to realize social and political orders attuned to its nature," end quote. His theory suggests that emotions are largely socially constructed, and this idea informs the conclusions drawn here that reveal a society in turmoil, seeking to reconstruct itself in the face of ongoing trauma. As diarists encountered the new behaviors of Germans, Jews, Lithuanians, Poles, and Ukrainians in the ghettos, they had to rethink and restructure their emotional universes to make sense of this behavior. Thus, they both drew on their pre-war arsenals of expectations and responses, for example, Emanuel Ringelblum and Herman Crook's left-wing political ideologies, and they constructed new ones. The same diarists break with traditional explanations for suffering. Barbara Rosenwein has presented a historical approach to the emotions that applies to the case of ghetto diarists as well, and she asserts, quote, "People lived and live in what I propose to call emotional communities. These are precisely the same as social communities, but the researcher looking at them seeks above all to uncover systems of feeling, what these communities and the individuals within them define and assess as valuable or harmful to them, the evaluations that they make about others' emotions, the nature or of the affective bonds between people that they recognize, and the modes of emotional expression that they expect, encourage, tolerate, and deplore," end quote. So using this method of examining systems of feeling revealed in ghetto diaries helps us to understand the, quote, "felt sense of quality of life at a particular time, place and time," end quote. The recurring emotions that appear in these diaries demonstrate that there were certain consistent ways that diarists responded to persecutors around them. This consistency suggests that though diaries certainly are somewhat different based on the time, place, and individual personalities and worldviews of their authors, there's also something shared about the way that Jews experienced life in the ghettos and reacted to persecutors around them. Jews living in Warsaw and Vilna at the end of the 1930s, though often divided by politics, religion, and language, also had in common some form of Jewish religious and cultural identity and sense of community, which was often intensified through ghettoization. Furthermore, tracing emotional shifts in ghetto diaries can also highlight major historical shifts and the ways that those living through them interpreted them. A focus on emotions therefore reveals that ghetto life was in no way static, and that those enduring it were constantly rethinking, revising, and refeeling their way through the chaos of daily life. Once we closely examine emotions represented in the diaries, seeing when diarists reacted with anger, confusion, sadness, fear, shock, etc., we begin to understand better what it felt like at the time. And once we have looked at the emotions revealed in the diaries to understand how victims felt about various perpetrators, we can begin to draw conclusions about how they evaluated those people. We can assume that emotions influence judgments, meaning that when we read the emotions, we get into a glimpse into evaluations. In other words, emotions becomes an important category of analysis through which we can assess the diarist's assessment of the world around them. Ultimately, these evaluations of persecutors exposed through reading emotions suggest important changes in diarist conceptions of society, community, and humanity. Surrounded by persecutors on all sides, ghetto diarists attempted to maintain moral agency through judging and denigrating in their writing those who hurt them. So diaries. The diaries I've included in this study today were written in the Warsaw and Vilna ghettos. They were written in close proximity within a matter of days or weeks to the events that they describe. I chose diaries that were dated and which thus demonstrated the slow uncovering of knowledge in the chaotic daily experience of the ghettos. I looked at diaries written as personal documents as well as those intended as more public chronicles. So some diaries like Yitzhak Rudashevsky and Abraham Levin's demonstrated passionate descriptions of daily life. Others like Herman Crook's and Emanuel Ringelblum's attempted to maintain some objective distance. I would argue, however, that both types revealed the emotional states of their authors, giving us a sense of their affective responses to those around them. Despite the best efforts of some, diarists' writings highlighted the messiness of daily life in which perceptions of perpetrators were first and foremost subjective, always colored by the changing reality of events, the personalities of the diarists, and the feelings and emotions engendered as a response to persecution. So, the fundamental finding of the study is that emotion words diarists use to implicate others do not always point to Germans and almost never remain consistent. In fact, the reactions to non-Jewish persecutors revealed the diarists' different expectations of different groups of people. They expected that Germans would behave as perpetrators par excellence, but they were surprised to see Poles, ethnic Germans, Lithuanians, and most of all fellow Jews playing the same part. The shock often led to feelings of anger and betrayal that far outstripped emotional responses to German perpetration. This does not mean that Jews and locals were the worst perpetrators, but it does suggest that ghetto inhabitants often felt them as such because of their transgression of pre-war norms of behavior. The emotional reactions to these closer persecutors signal diarists' attempts to grapple with the changing social situation in the ghetto and to reconstruct and/or maintain their conceptions of an ethical right in the face of so many who seems to have forgotten them. So most of the diaries examined in this study, to start with kind of the description of the terminology, use neutral terms to describe perpetrators the majority of the time. Perpetrators appeared frequently, but the descriptions of them were usually more situational than descriptive, and this goes especially for German perpetrators. The authors explained what happened, including the perpetrators of crimes, but with little extraneous description. So, for example, a group of Germans came into the ghetto. They also quite often used a passive voice, refusing to name perpetrators at all. So, for example, 5 Jews were shot in the ghetto today. Several of the diaries used in this study, however, contain particularly rich examinations of those around them. Emanuel Ringelblum and Abraham Levin from Warsaw, and Herman Kruk and Yitzhak Rudiszewski from Vilna in particular, each wrote extensive diaries that covered several years of the ghetto period and delved deeply into issues of humanity and relationships within the ghetto. A close reading of these diaries reveals less common, yet still readily abundant descriptive language. Sometimes many pages pass before a specifically emotional term appears in the text. So reading these and reading for emotions and even reading for moments of discussion of perpetrators sometimes can be a very slow process. Other times, each paragraph contains a plethora of adjectives that point exactly to the mental state of the author. I designate these more descriptive adjectives as loaded language, suggesting that the words themselves point to the author's feelings and judgments. Most revealing are the rare moments during which diarists use long series of emotion-laden words to describe a situation, and these were usually during extreme events like deportations, which will be the focus of the examples that I'll talk about today. This release of emotional sentiment caused by an overload of suffering, anxiety, outrage, and helplessness is our first indication of the radical break in interpretations of Jewish police and councils that happened after the mass deportations in the summer and fall of 1942 in Warsaw. So that's what I'm taking up. The project is much larger, but today this is what I'm discussing, is the shift from before and after the Great Deportations in 1942 in Warsaw and after October 1942 in Vilna, when the Jewish police there were tasked with helping to round up and maybe or maybe not took part in murdering Jews in the Oshmiana area outside of Vilna. So I'm going to use 2 examples today from this period to describe this kind of emotional reading that I've been doing. So Yitzhak Rudiszewski, a teenager living in the Vilna ghetto, wrote a personal diary which described both events which happened to him and his family directly, as well as situations he witnessed and heard about from others. He demonstrated his emotional state dramatically with a description of the Jewish police in the Vilna ghetto. The police there, under the leadership of Jacob Gens, though known as an occasionally violent proxy of the German authorities, was generally met with ambivalence by the ghetto population. After Gens became the sole leader of the ghetto and Jewish council in June 1942, the Germans called on the police to take a more active role in the persecution of nearby Jews. We have daily notes written by Rudiszewski from September 1942, as well as notes dated as early as June 1941, which seem to be later writings on those earlier events. So I start with the dated entries in September 42. So until October 1942, Rudiszewski generally described the Jewish police's role in the ghetto as kind of disappointing. He related instances in which they helped Germans to oppress Jews. And there were various cases throughout that month. However, the references before October 42 are brief and not emotionally laden. You know, the Jewish police did this, they did that, but without this kind of loaded language. On October 18th, 1942, however, Rudashevsky gave a long and detailed description of the local Jewish police force. So, quote, "Suddenly, one bright day, Jewish policemen donned official hats. I walk across the street, and here go some of them wearing leather jackets, boots, and green round hats with glossy peaks and stars of David. They march smartly by in unison. Jackets are being loaned by the force in the streets. They impress you as Lithuanians, as kidnappers. An unpleasant feeling comes over me. I hate them from the bottom of my heart. Ghetto Jews in uniforms, and how arrogantly they stride in the boots they have plundered. The entire ghetto is stunned. Everyone feels the same way about them, and they have somehow become such strangers to the ghetto. In me, they arouse a feeling compounded of ridicule, disgust, and fear." End quote. So Rudashevsky reveals his emotions very directly in this quote. He says that he has an unpleasant feeling and that he hates these Jews. Further, he claims to speak for the entire ghetto community, stating that the entire ghetto is stunned and feel the same things regarding the police: ridicule, disgust, and fear. With these emotion words, he points to the shock and betrayal he and presumably other ghetto inhabitants felt at the behavior of fellow Jews who now imitated outside perpetrators. Importantly, Rudashevsky did not refer here to German perpetrators, but rather to Lithuanians. The Jewish police in Vilna appeared to him more like the Lithuanians who had been directly involved in kidnapping and slaughter since the outbreak of war in 1941, than like Germans, who were seen less often and removed from the ghetto, although that's also a little different in Vilna, that Muir was a very present German in the Vilna ghetto that many diarists also took on. So what most characterized outside enemies here was a strong, proud arrogance, personified by shiny new uniforms, and Rudashevsky understand that the police, who were in a position of relative power over the ghetto populace, could not emulate Germans or Lithuanians without becoming like them. All at once, these fellow Jews appeared as the other and no longer to be trusted. By dint of their wardrobe, they had become strangers in their own community. In fact, this entry presages the Vilna Ghetto Police's involvement in the killings at Oshmiana, which was a turning point in the history of the Vilna Ghetto and the moment after which the Jewish leaders and police there could no longer claim clean hands in the destruction of Lithuania's Jews. The strong negative affect displayed by Rudashevsky in this entry and attributed to the whole ghetto dramatically demonstrates his perception of those Jews and the breakdown of society that their behavior indicated. The Nazis had truly succeeded in sowing distrust, fear, and anger within the Jewish community, an essential part of their divide and conquer policy. Rudashevsky used his emotions here to demonstrate a shift in attitudes as well as to describe what he saw as one of the worst of all of the terrible things happening to ghetto inhabitants. His strong emotions indicated a sense of betrayal and anger surpassing that felt toward other perpetrators like Lithuanians and Germans, which shows us that it mattered more to him when Jews participated in persecutions. It mattered more to him because it was a transgression of expectations that Jews should help each other, especially in moments of extreme distress. The fact that they did the opposite in this particular case pushed Rudashevsky to respond emotionally. His emotions highlight the radical importance of this event in the life of the Vilna ghetto and in the societal divide between different groups of Jews that it engendered. In Warsaw, Emanuel Ringelblum, historian and organizer of the Oinek Shabbos archive, conceived of his diary as a more objective chronicle of events rather than a personal document describing his individual experiences. He determined to write it in that manner so that it might be received uncritically by those reading it in the future. In December 1942, he expressed his concern over the potential that his and other diarists and reporters' accountings of their experiences might seem exaggerated. To counter that, they, quote from Ringelblum, made a conscious effort to that the course of events in every town and the experience of every Jew would come across simply and faithfully. Every superfluous word, every literary turn of language or embellishment grates on the ear and evokes resentment. Wartime Jewish life is so rich in tragedy that it is unnecessary to enrich it with a superfluous line, end quote. Ringelblum recognized the potential turn toward a subjectivity that would, in his mind, undermine the testimonies he collected for a post-war reading audience. According to Ringelblum, one could only avoid subjectivity and make a positive historical contribution by understanding the limitations of one's own limitations and working to moderate them. However, Ringelblum, like other diarists, could not keep out all aspects of emotions from his writings. Even Ringelblum's basic chronicle of events, written in incomplete fragments of sentences sometimes, and never referring to the author's personal life, revealed the sentiments of the author himself. The trauma and the tragedy of events were too strong to preclude such human emotions. So Ringelblum and most Warsaw diarists mainly presented varied conceptions of the role of Warsaw's Jewish Council. So headed initially by Adam Chernikov, the council had to be reformed after Chernikov's suicide in opposition to German orders to help with deportations in July of 1942. In the diaries, this suicide was met with mixed interpretations. Some believed that Chernikov had behaved in a cowardly way by not remaining to fight back and to warn ghetto inhabitants, and others recognized a heroism in his resistance. In any case, this event, in contrast with the egregious or perceived egregious corruption of many council officials, meant that diarists approached the topic of the Jewish councils in very different ways at different times throughout the ghetto. They did not regularly disparage the council, but they revealed their critiques in dramatic moments when they could no longer stifle their emotions, like Ringelblum, and their resulting judgments. So even before the Great Deportation to Treblinka and summer and fall of 1942, Ringelblum interpreted the behavior of those around him in the ghetto as something less than acceptable. In January 1942, he wrote, quote, "During these days of hunger, the inhumanity of the Jewish upper class has clearly shown itself. The entire work of the Jewish Council is an evil perpetrated against the poor that cries to the very heaven," end quote. Here, his loaded language was not as direct as Rudiszewski's. He didn't state his anger, frustration, disappointment. However, in accusing the Jewish Council of evil inhumanity, he clearly demonstrated his emotional reaction to these people. These were words that went beyond the basic description and that indicated personal judgment. In revealing here his inability to understand how members of the same community could act so greedily and do so little to help one another, and again, this is in the framework of his very left-wing, very socially oriented worldview, Ringelblum indicated that he felt that this conduct was simply outside the realm of humanity. As the situation got worse for the Jews and the Jewish police become involved in carrying out deportations, Ringelblum's potential ability to find compassion with Jewish policemen disintegrated. During the Great Deportation in fall 1942, Ringelblum exclaimed regarding the Jewish police, quote, "They weren't content simply to overcome the resistance, but with the utmost severity punished the criminals who refused to go to their death voluntarily. Every Warsaw Jew, every woman and child can cite thousands of cases of the inhuman cruelty and violence of the Jewish police. Those cases will never be forgotten by survivors, and they must and shall be paid for," end quote. The Jewish police here garnered Ringelblum's utmost disgust and anger. He used his rhetoric to indicate his emotional state. The repetition of every indicates the scale of the atrocity, and the use of the term inhuman cruelty clearly demonstrates Ringelblum's assessment of these policemen. He had seen their behavior at the moment of choice between collaborating and becoming just regular victims that would have been, with those that they had been, becoming equal victims with those that they would have deported. The choosing on the side of collaboration, of becoming partners with the Germans rather than with the other ghetto inhabitants, lowered the Jewish police in Ringelblum's mind to the level of the inhuman. His emotional reaction to these men stands out because of its difference from the regularly objective tone of his other entries. It indicates to us the importance of this event in the ghetto and for Ringelblum's perception of community breakdown. He ousted these perpetrators not only from the society of Jews, but from the world of people altogether. In his frustration, he could only call out for revenge, a last resort produced by his feeling of helplessness in the face of the situation. So these two examples, in addition to tens of others that I use in the larger research and hundreds of others, if we look at the project as a whole, clearly demonstrate how the affective language used in Diaries can elucidate ghetto experiences. Reading the instances of emotion-motivated judgment is an important approach to understanding the perceptions of these people living in the midst of an ever-increasing persecution. The intensifying emotions revealed as suffering turned to outright mass murder remind us of the individual humanity of each victim. They wrote their feelings as a way of maintaining a sense of humanity and power over situations and people which were new, constantly changing, and ultimately destructive. More importantly, the focus on emotions, when and how they appear, shows that people living within the ghettos expressed much more concern and worry about closer persecutors like local Poles and fellow Jews than they did about the obvious German perpetrators. This reminds us that the Holocaust was not only about the murder of 6 million Jews, but also about the immense amount of physical and psychological suffering they endured before the murder. They had to witness heartbreaking scenes in which former friends and even family members turned against one another, either because of the terrible living conditions or at the behest of German occupiers. They had to come to terms with the fact that Jews, like other people, seemed susceptible to bribery and corruption, even at the expense of other Jews' lives. When Abraham Levin cried out in July 24, 1942, quote, "The savagery of the police during the roundup, the murderous brutality. They drag girls from the rickshaws, empty out flats, and leave the property strewn everywhere. A pogrom and a killing the like of which has never been seen," end quote. He revealed his emotions and anger and incredulity to underline the incomprehensibility of the reality that he witnessed. He and others like him consistently contemplated and tried to make sense of these actions throughout their writings, demonstrating the serious challenges to their beliefs about the meaning of life and humanity these actions provoked, as well as their desperate attempts to maintain them.